Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about two different podcasts. They both talk about diversity in the school education system. The first one is The Problem We All Live With Part 1, and this is narrated by an African American reporter, and she is interviewing a African American mother and daughter and their experiences during the Normandy 2013 education problem that they were having at their school. So a little background that we learned in the podcast is that Normandy School in Missouri had been on probation for their accreditation for 15 years, which in and of itself is a little crazy, that they would have a probationary period for 15 years without trying to help make it better, give it more funding, send more teachers, do trainings, or anything like that. So that really blew me away. Another thing that really blew my mind was that when Normandy shut down finally because they lost their accreditation, a transfer law that was apparently in legislation had allowed students to go to a different school. However, Francis Howe, which was an 85% predominant white school, did not want them to go. And so they just tried to make it as difficult as possible. And this just kind of frustrated me when I was listening to it, because it's 2013 and you are still dealing with segregation. This school Francis Howe had a town meeting of sorts where parents and educators could come and talk about their concerns, and they just made it seem like it was going to be the worst thing in the world to have these 1,000 students who decided to transfer out come to their school. And they just, it was just so crazy listening to it. I thought I was just gonna cry, because the daughter who was in the interview, Maria, she was there at the meeting and she heard everything that these parents and teachers were saying, and it just kind of broke your heart to hear that this was still happening. When you hear, I went on to listen to part 2 of that podcast just so I could hear what was happening. And after the school and the state took over Normandy, gave it a non-accredited status, and making that transfer law that was in place null and void, and made those thousands of kids come back to Normandy, even though they didn't want to. That is just crazy, that instead of making the school better, of letting the 3,000 children that were still in Normandy transfer out, they're like, no, we're gonna give you a new name, a new accreditation, and we're just gonna bring back everyone that left. It really blew my mind. And the fact that even after they got the new name, they got a new accreditation status, they still didn't have teachers willing to teach, no substitutes for half of the classes, and only one teacher was willing to teach anything, and I believe that was an English teacher, if I remember correctly. So that just, it's crazy to think that 2013 come and gone, and we're still having problems with integration and diversity and acceptance. Moving on to the second podcast, which is The Problem We All Live With, Act 2. This was a podcast between 3 people. One was the podcast creator, and he kind of just sat back, give a little information, and then let 2 reporters kind of not duke it out, but talk through what was happening. One was African American, one was white, and they were talking about Jefferson County in Kentucky, and how legislation in Kentucky, not just for Jefferson County, though they were talking about it, was behind its time, and how, again, in a different state, integration is not happening, and how when the Obama legislation came about, Senator Duncan put through a campaign called Race to the Top, and the 2 reporters went to talk about how they thought this was the best place to put in integration legislation and diversity acceptance. But after Obama came into office, that this didn't happen. They went to interview the senator, and he kept reiterating that it wasn't the right time, it was going to be very difficult to get passed, state government wasn't going to approve anything new for integration, and it wasn't a very long podcast, and they didn't give a lot of background information, but I just felt like, why would you start a campaign like Race to the Top that was all about integration, pretty much, like in its basic form, trying to get schools to lose its segregation status, but still not trying to make integration work. So you're trying to get schools to appear less racist, but you are not passing any laws to help that. It just kind of really struck a chord with me, I guess. It was just really weird to hear that they were doing campaigns to try to stop the problem, but it wasn't stopping the problem, it was just kind of hiding it, masking the issue. I think it really depends when I start working how this sort of information should be handled. I at least have 2 more years before I'm even going to get my bachelor's degree. And so at least 2 years before I get into a teaching environment. And I really hope by then that integration and diversity and acceptance for all cultures has been finished and is not an issue anymore. But if I had any advice at all, to any new teachers, any colleagues that I've already met and am working with when this comes about, I think that just trying to get to know your students, not as a group, but as individuals, will go a long way in getting everyone to be equal and bringing in that equality that so many schools apparently are lacking right now. And so I really, really hope that in the next 2 years we can get to that part, that time in our social lives. Government can step up their game, don't continue to drop the ball, and we have that new legislation, that new laws that help desegment children in an educational system, because once you're labeled, it's hard to get out of that box. And for children, especially young children, to be labeled so early on in life, they just feel defeated. And I think that is the problem, is that we're teaching them young to be defeated. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.